Okay, right, so we've gone from Europe to the world, finally capping off with an overview from Guloren Turan of Global CCS Institute, which is what it says on the tin. I have to say, it's now sort of expanded quite a lot from its original home in Australia, got everywhere. And doing everything. Guloren brings a lot of experience to the area. She's worked on strategy and risk at BG Group, and more recently on public relations for the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline, which sounds like a nice place to go and visit. I think I could manage that. And is now looking at CCS impact, which is obviously an area that we're all interested in. And do they give you a bonus on the number of CCS projects that actually happen?
I joined the institute. So
very good, very good. I think I'd recommend you for a bonus on the basis of that, yes. So, a lot going on, a lot in the world. I'm sure we all read the annual publication and see what's happening with a lot of interest. And, well, I don't think I'll say any more. You'll see it all in the presentation. There's a lot going on.
Thanks, John, and thank you to the UKCCSRC for inviting me here to deliver the sort of closing remarks. As John said yesterday, we started with the UK, dwelled quite into the projects that are happening. This morning, we looked at Europe and, of course, the key countries of Canada, Japan, and China. And I'll try to sort of bring it all together to give the, so to speak, the 7,000 feet view of CCS and more broadly, carbon management around the world. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Global CCS Institute, we are an international think tank that aims to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture, storage, and removals around the world for a net zero future. We are present in 7 countries, including the UK. Our headquarters in Melbourne, Australia. We're in the US, in Belgium, China, Japan, and in the UAE. And we have over 200 members, including governments, businesses, research bodies, and NGOs, all committed to a net zero future. So the climate math is clear. If we're to reach our climate targets, we need to accelerate the deployment of carbon management technologies, CCS, CCU, and CDR to gigaton scale. This was the conclusion of the groundbreaking IPCC 1.5 degree report. And since then, we have seen increased momentum in the deployment of carbon management technologies around the world. The growing urgency to address climate change has meant that felt by policymakers, by industry, by the public at large, meant that there's increased deployment in many regions around the world. As John said, our flagship publication is the Global Status of CCS report, and we released the 2023 report in November. And according to the report, we've been seeing very strong momentum in the growth of the CCS project pipeline, projects in operation and under construction and development, now 6 years in a row, growing at an average of 35% per annum since 2017. So immense momentum in the project deployment around the world. As of July 2023, which is when we kind of took this, sort of set the stop for the status report, we have globally 41 facilities, CCS and commercial large-scale CCS and CDR facilities, engineered CDR facilities in operation, with a capacity to capture and store around almost close to 50 million tons of CO2 per annum. And we have more than 350 projects in development in the around the world, or commercial projects around the world. Now, growth has been driven by very strong policy, particularly in Europe and in North America, but I'll come to it in a moment, in other parts of the world as well, not just confined to North America and Europe, but driven by sort of very strong policies. And one thing to bear in mind is, whilst this momentum is great, We are looking at sort of close to 400 facilities in development. We're looking at several 100 million tons of capacity in development. We need to get to around a gigaton level of capture and storage by 2030 and multiple gigatons by 2050. So clearly still a huge challenge ahead of us in order to scale up deployment even further. And one thing that we heard this morning in the corridors of this conference is, as projects are progressing from the sort of planning and development to execution phase, issues with permitting, public acceptance, project management, and including cost management are going to become increasingly critical in order to ensure that the deployment timelines remain within reach. So I mentioned that the growth is driven predominantly by policy. When we look at the countries around the world, we see that CCS has been increasingly featured, CCS or carbon management more broadly, in countries, what's called the nationally determined contributions. These are the 5-year plans under the Paris Agreement. We have now close to 30 countries which include CCS in their NDCs, and almost 80% of the countries that submitted their long-term plans, climate plans under the Paris Agreement, include carbon management technologies. There is increasingly growing collaboration between governments. You may have heard about the Carbon Management Challenge, which was officially launched at the recent COP. There are more than 15 countries that are signatories. UK is one of the co-leads of that, and as with US. But other than that, countries like Brazil and Indonesia are also part of the Carbon Management Challenge. And the goal of the challenge is to ensure that CCS can be scaled, or carbon management more broadly can be scaled up to a gigaton level by 2030. There is also the Sunderland's agreement, for example, between the US and China, which both countries are aiming to develop at least 5, or work on sort of developing 5 large-scale CCS projects each. So clearly lots of attention at the international level. International CCS models are being developed. We saw the first transboundary shipment of CO2 for geologic storage between Denmark and Belgium in 2023. And there is increased support and regulation and policy support in other parts of the world, and particularly in Asia as well. So this is the CCS facility pipeline, the project pipeline. And as I mentioned to John earlier, I joined Institute in 2018, and since then you can see the pipeline has been growing enormously, all thanks to me, not. At the moment, we have 49 million tons of capacity in operation. And one of the key things about this chart is today in 2023 and 2024, actually, we have the largest both number and capacity of CCS projects under construction of any time in the history of the sector. And it's worth noting that we added around almost 200 facilities in 1 year since the release of the 2020 status report. So in 2023, almost 200 facilities have been added to the pipeline. So enormous momentum, but still a lot of work to do. And here is a map of the global CCS facilities. A few things to note here. I mean, I think when you look at the map, the visual concentration of the dots, it's very clear that there's a lot happening in North America, a lot going on in Europe, some activity, actually good activity in the Middle East, and in Asia, APAC region and Asia. But, and you can see a couple of dots in Latin America, where of course Petrobras has been operating for a number of years now. But if we're going to get to gigaton scale, when we look at all these projects that are either operating or under construction, we get to several 100 million tons, around 400 million tons, sort of bottom-up level. But if we're going to get to gigaton level by 2030 and beyond, we obviously need to get the rest of the world, the global south, starting to deploy CCS and CDR and CCU, of course, carbon management. And that's a challenge that we, as the CCS community, are facing in order to to scale up carbon management. Now, this is a little bit of a more complicated chart, but it shows the different applications of CCS on the y-axis and the timeline of when the projects either came online or are expected to come online on the x-axis. And I think what this demonstrates is the increased versatility and increased sectors that CCS is being applied to. If you look at this sort of more towards the left-hand side, the earlier applications of carbon management in CCS were in lower cost applications of CCS, such as natural gas processing, such as fertilizer and ethanol production. But when we look into the right-hand side, when we look into the kind of projects under development, we see a lot more new sectors coming into the picture, including in power generation, including in cement and steel industries, and of course, CDR, direct air capture as well. One other aspect that we're seeing is the sort of, for us, the creation almost of a different facility type, the CO2 transport and storage facilities, because as we're moving from sort of integrated projects into hub and cluster models, we're having more emphasis being placed on the development and of transport and storage infrastructure. And here is, again, kind of talking about transport and storage. This is the result of emergence of CCS networks, where we're seeing CO2 transport logistics becoming more complicated. Pipelines were the dominant transport modes for projects, and they still will continue to be so, because it's a mature technology, been commercial operation for long years. But now there's a growing proportion of projects, networks that are looking to deploy shipping, and even barges, for example, in continental Europe. So shipping is becoming quite an important element of CO2 transportation. I've heard people kind of look at the CO2 transport and storage almost like and compare it to the LNG industry, the early days of the LNG industry, where whether we'll be able to transport CO2 for storage into the sort of lowest cost storage site at a given time. And shipping companies are looking into new and larger designs for CO2 ships, up to sort of 80,000 cubic meters is what I've heard. So when we look at the right-hand side, this is about geologic storage, or rather storage of CO2. And one of the sort of key facts is that when we look at the 40 plus facilities in operation today, only a quarter of them use geologic aquifer storage, with the rest having used enhanced oil recovery for CO2. But when we look at the facilities in our database that are in construction or under development, we see that almost 80% of them are planning to use dedicated geologic storage, so either saline aquifers or depleted oil and gas reservoirs. So certainly a change in the type of CO2 storage that we see in the project pipeline. So just sort of a bit of a canter through what's been happening around the world. A lot of this is what we heard already this morning and yesterday. In Europe, there are more than 100 facilities under development. Of course, the European Commission announced its 2040 emission reduction targets, and as we heard comprehensively from you this morning, the EU Industrial Carbon Management Strategy has been released. The EU, through the Innovation Fund, it's at 3 calls up to now, and is supposed to invest in 22 CCS and CCU projects, and these are the only first 3 calls, and I'd like to say counting. Of course, the countries individually are progressing their CCS policies and projects. We heard a lot about the UK. We know the target of the 20 to 30 million tons, but I think it's also noteworthy to mention that France and Germany have released and kind of are developing their carbon management strategies. Austria is in there as well. So there is individual activity at the member state in EU as well. When we look at North America, the US leads globally with project and policy development. We heard about, David mentioned, not David, we heard from Neil about 45Q, which is, of course, the tax credit, but also it's worth noting the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is allocated $12 billion for carbon management. So it's not just the tax credit, but there's a lot of support and comprehensive policy in the US for carbon management. Of course, not withstanding the kind of the cost pressures that we're observing. And again, we heard quite in detail from Neil about Canada, where the federal government released its its CCUS strategy. There's a sort of investment tax credit, and lots of activity at the state level in Canada as well, and Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular. But this is not just a US or North America or Europe phenomenon. We're seeing also a lot of interest and developments on CCS and CDR in the MENA region as well as in APAC. In the MENA region, there are 3 already operating facilities accounting for almost 10% of global kind of operational capacity in the KSA, in Qatar and in the UAE, including the large-scale steel plant that captures CO2 in the UAE. And it's the net zero targets and strong emphasis on industrial decarbonization that's driving CCS in the region. Just before the COP in UAE, ADNOC took FID on the Habshan gas processing facility. When we look at KSA, it's the most recent joiner to the Institute, the government joiner to the Institute. The El Jubail Industrial Hub aims to capture and store around El Jubail by 9 million tons per annum, and KSA a total of 44 million tons of CO2 by 2035. In November, Oman's Ministry of Energy launched an initiative to establish a CCS and blue hydrogen framework, which we're helping them with. So quite a lot of activity in the MENA region, obviously hydrogen being an important driver, and they're seeing this as an important export option for the region. When we look at the APAC region, the transboundary transport of CO2 is emerging as both an issue and an opportunity. Projects positioning to receive third-party CO2 storage, particularly in places like Malaysia and Indonesia. They're looking to import potentially CO2 from the likes of Japan or Singapore. Japan, as we heard, sort of selected their first 7 candidate projects for feasibility studies. This is in line with their roadmap to deliver up to 240 million tons of CCS capacity by 2050. Again, we heard from Professor Ji Liang intensively, but China's first megaton project started operations. They now have the largest coal with CCS facility in Asia. It's 0.5 million tons per annum. They have another new one under construction that's going to be above a gigaton, and they have had their 100-kilometer pipeline starting operations. So a lot of progress in China, still policy support, not comprehensive policy support at the federal level, but lots of progress. And again, project progress happening in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Australia. Having said all of this, and having given the glass half full picture, needless to say, getting to the required scale of CCS deployment around the world will require all of us to work together. Existing policies and pledges, delivering the existing project pipeline will get us to a few 100 million tons of capacity per year. We need to get to a gigaton and then to multiple gigatons by 2050. And in order to be able to do this, deployment in emerging markets and developing economies should increase significantly. And in order to scale up CCS, the highest levels of safety, accountability, community engagement need to be, of course, incorporated into all projects. And particularly when we look at 2030, when we look at the UK, when we look at Europe, we've seen project timelines of 6, 7, 8 years. The project timelines need to decrease significantly if we're to achieve the targets the level of deployment that we need to have by 2030. And last but not least, governments still in the driving seat in order to kind of develop and implement more supportive policies to drive investment in the OECD as well as the rest of the world. And with that, I'd like to turn over back to John for his closing remarks.
We actually do have time for a few quick questions, if there are any. Yes, down at the front here.
So with the explosion in the number of announced projects, how do you collect the data that forms the presentation? And can you talk a bit about the challenges of actually tracking what's going on? Because it's very confusing for a lot of people. There's so much media coverage of CCS, and projects are at all different stages. So how do you deal with that?
Again, that's a great question. And we're also having different databases kind of by different organizations as well. One of the things that we do is we pride ourselves in the due diligence that we undertake. But the challenge then has been, as you said, that there are a lot of projects that are being announced. And we, in 2022, we added a new category called announced projects. And they're not in these bar charts that you see, but so it actually adds to the number. If we're not able to kind of get satisfactory information about a project, we put it in the announced category. So one can go in and find those. These are the projects that we were able to, and sort of the categories are, early development, advanced development. So even for the development stages and under construction, we kind of put them into those buckets. But if we weren't able to find further data, they're just in the announced categories and not in the slides that you saw in there.
And can I just ask, when you take projects off, because that's the other thing, that at least in the past, projects stayed on the list for a long time and they probably weren't going to happen.
That's also a great question, because we need to kind of have we basically work with the project developers and sponsors and get their kind of like agreement on whether to put projects on or take them off. So that's how that happens.
Okay. Any other questions? One at the back there.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you for that presentation. I'm wondering about how you are tracking legal cases. So recent UN report said that 90% of our CO2 emissions are either directly or indirectly from oil and gas companies. And, given that we have temporarily breached 1.5 over the past few months, I think oil and gas companies, have quite a lot of responsibility and therefore might also have some legal liabilities coming their way. So how are you tracking that, and how are you going to think through some of these complicated legal challenges going forward? Because, attribution is going to be a bit of a problem.
I think what we're seeing, of course, is kind of the requirement for disclosures, and that's increasingly kind of stringent and more important. Although, having said that, it seems to be, from a personal point of view, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. For example, when we look at the SEC recent kind of adoption of this, as the Institute, we're trying to encourage and educate about how CCS should be incorporated into ESG reporting in particular. And similar to you, we're kind of looking at litigations that's happening sort of around the world. It's a interesting place for all of us.
Okay, I think we better stop there, just in the interest of getting to lunch and getting people on their trains. Thank you very much. That was very, very good.